Katie. Well, hello and welcome to this session. As Katie said, exploring the National Skills Audit and what its findings mean. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Alison Ross, Platform and Operations and People Director at Auto Trader, Mel Kanarek, Director of Sheffield Digital, and Ben Shorrock, Managing Director of Tech Spark. So thank you all for joining us. Before we dig into the report, it'd be good to hear from each of you a little bit about who you are and why you're here. So, Alison, should we start with you?
Yeah, I'm the chair of Manchester Digital, and I've been involved for 5 or 6 years. So I'd like to think I've got some good insight into how our members are faring during the pandemic. My day job, as you mentioned, is at Audit Trader, where I've got some pretty broad responsibilities for tech, people, and culture. And certainly this year has been incredibly difficult, I would say.
Okay, well, we'll hear more about that maybe later. Mel.
Thanks, Martin. Hi, everyone. I'm Mel Kanarek. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of Sheffield Digital, which represents the digital industries in Sheffield and South Yorkshire. My day job is whatever I can lay my hands to. I'm a self-employed person. I do a lot of work in the digital sector. I'm also interested in startups and innovation.
Okay, and Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Shorrock. I am the MD of an organisation called Tech Spark. Tech Spark is not dissimilar at all to Manchester Digital, except we are focused on the tech community around Bristol, Bath and Swindon. So a bit further down south, but I'm originally from up in Lancashire and spent a lot of time in Manchester. So always really interested to see how our two communities are sort of doing things and having similar challenges and opportunities and what we can learn from one another.
Absolutely. So, well, let's dig into the report then. And first of all, I think it'd be interesting to look at what Katie was kind of pointing at there, was how it's been a challenging year for much of our industry and all industries, really, or most industries, certainly. And that in many ways feeds into a lot of the people who work in our industry, many, of course, whom are B2B. But as well as that, and something I've seen with some of the companies I work with as well is a lot of success as well. A lot of people really adapting well and expanding their businesses. 42% of businesses reported an increase in their revenue, 32% stayed the same, 26% contracted. 37% of self-employed suffered a loss of revenue, which is obviously a bad thing, but that implies that more of the self-employed were either around the same or doing better. So it'd be good to get a sense from your parts of the world how things are going. So Alison, you kind of hinted at something there, so it'd be good to hear what your thoughts.
Well, I think this is what we always say: digital is clearly not a monolith, so it rather depends what sector you're in, how you have fared. So Manchester has always been very strong in e-commerce and agencies, for instance. So many of the e-commerce businesses are absolutely booming, as you would fully expect, as the sort of trend to do more and more online increases. But then maybe some of our agency businesses are working with reduced advertising spend, particularly if their clients are like bricks and mortar, non-essential retail. So it really does depend. At our employers forum, it is the case that even businesses who are doing well and who've maybe grown their revenue are still thinking very much about how they're structured. So very few businesses are kind of untouched by redundancies, I would say, because most businesses have got bits or roles that probably no longer apply. So even where the situation feels very upbeat for some organizations, it's definitely the case that kind of restructuring and rethinking and reimagining business models will have effects both positive and negative.
Does that chime with your findings, Mel, in Sheffield?
I think, the business environment is different here in Sheffield. We've got far fewer very large companies. They're mostly quite small. And for the majority of them, there was an initial sharp intake of breath with the first lockdown and sorting out what was going on. And then once people settled in, once they discovered what their clients were doing, then they started to get into a new rhythm. And certainly what we've seen is the businesses that were very clear on what their offer was to their client base and how they were going to push that forward have really continued with that growth. businesses that were less clear have taken the opportunity to pivot to really respond to what their clients and their customers were looking for. And that's driving growth as well. Where we have seen companies finding it harder, it's perhaps because their offer is very undifferentiated. So it's hard for them to continue to compete, but also they didn't really have their sales and marketing activity going well before the lockdown. So they've come from a standing start to try and figure out how to continue to grow. The really heartening thing I've seen is a lot of businesses have, particularly software development agencies, have looked at their customer base and the struggles that those customers are dealing with and thought about how can we help, how can we deal with these problems? And that's where we see new products, new services coming to market very quickly. And that's something that's driving growth, and certainly it's driving a demand for skills as well.
Yeah, I did a report for Manchester Digital about how digital companies were coping with the pandemic in the middle of last year, and it was very heartening to see that some companies really were adapting and saying, how can we help the businesses around us? And really taking the initiative and going out and saying, we can do this for you, and helping save, in some cases, businesses out there. So Ben, are you seeing a similar story in your part of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo Alison and Mel's points. I think we have had parts of the community that have been really successful and have grown a lot in the last few months. All sorts of different sectors, but what they all boil down to is people who can do things from home. So our fintech businesses are doing really well because lots of people are sat at home looking at their finances. E-coms, gaming, some of the digital publishing businesses all doing great because people are sat at home and they're suddenly engaging more and more with those products and those businesses. There have also been businesses that have really struggled. So a good example for us locally is the aerospace sector. So aerospace is a really big employer, a big sector here locally, has obviously been hit globally. But there are silver linings to that. So one of the things it's made a lot of those businesses do is really look at what they're doing in terms of digital transformation and innovation in a much more, it's really gone up their priority list effectively. So there's a lot of focus on that and a lot of focus on how they can make sure they have the right skill sets. So it's difficult because in many ways there's been a lot of positives come out of this, but at the same time, it's not a scenario any of us would have wanted to go into.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like it has been a real trial by fire for businesses. You got to survive now, challenging times. But we've talked about companies making changes which have allowed them to survive, or making changes to their offering, the way they operate, etc. How much of this is going to be a long-term change? Obviously, there's lots of talk about businesses quitting their offices, or shifting entirely to remote, or doing a lot more remote work, and maybe companies having to change their businesses. I mean, are these going to be long-term changes for the companies that have had to adapt their business models? It may be a little bit too early to say, but Ben, what's your sense? So, are we seeing the start of something new, or just some sticking plasters that will have to be ripped off later?
So inevitably it's a mix of the two. I think there's a lot of businesses who've changed their model and pivoted and have found new opportunities and new markets, and they're definitely going to be keeping up with that. One of the things I think not just us but all of our colleagues in the sort of wider city have seen is a sudden realization that almost every business is a digital business and they have to think that way. And that is a realization that has really struck, and I think will have a long-term change. I think a lot of the other things that we're talking about, they'll be nowhere near as severe the changes as they could be. So at the beginning of this, lots of people were saying they could work from home and it was great. I think, 11 months on, lots of us can work from home, but a lot of us would like to spend at least some of the time back in the office. And I, for one, am certainly sick of being in this house. So I think, it's never going to be, we'll move 100% in one direction. There's definitely going to be a mix of those things coming through.
Are you seeing that too, Mel?
Yeah, it was interesting because there are a couple of smaller companies in the city who quite early on said, we're ditching our office, we're going totally remote, it's marvelous, we love the way we're working. And then when you dug into it a little bit more, you found out that they were still finding opportunities to meet together in person, obviously in a safe way. So I think what we're going to see is a return to a much more flexible and hybrid way of working, but I don't think we're seeing the end of the office altogether. Something that people have been very concerned about as they got over the initial thing about, oh, hey, we can all work remotely, isn't this great, is they started to realize some of the things that they were losing. And particularly for younger and less experienced members of the team, they were missing the social interaction. They were missing the informal coaching that you get just from being sat in a team and all working together and hearing what's going on. And I think for a lot of businesses, they're keeping a very close eye on that, on how their people are coping with being remote all the time, but what's happening as well in terms of learning and development. And I think that's going to be something that's going to have to be watched very closely. Just to pick up on one of the other things that's been discussed, this issue of every business is a digital business now. They've all realized that. I would like to hope that we're going to see a revolution in digital adoption. But I think that for an awful lot of businesses that have been hard hit, it's just going to be about survival, about keeping the lights on, about what happens when furlough ends, and whether they're actually going to have the energy and the resource to look at digital adoption is going to be a big question mark. I don't know which way it's going to go, but it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a skills audit, and the point about skills, I think, and giving younger people a real grounding in the industry is an interesting one. I remember Facebook saying, I think last year, at some point when all the big tech companies went through these, we're letting you work at home for 3 months, then it became 6 months, then it became a year, then 2 years, and then some of them were saying just work at home forever. Except I think Facebook said, but we want our interns and our new employees, our new starters, to be in the office at HQ so they can learn. But then when you reach a certain stage, you can go on and work wherever you want. Alison, how are things in Manchester on that front? What have you heard from companies in terms of skilling up the younger people in a more remote world?
Yeah, so it's definitely the case that, as Mel was saying, we definitely saw a sort of a curve of companies getting a bit giddy, if anything, about the possibilities of full remote working. And as the reality of that has set in, a bit more sort of, I guess, a bit more balanced view. And how we deal with early careers people is definitely part of that. I think everybody knows that everybody's finding recruiting people, onboarding people, making people feel like they're part of your company, your culture is incredibly difficult. And to the point of, generally speaking, investing in your early careers pipeline is the advice that we would give all companies. The developers do not grow on trees. It's always going to be difficult to get your mid-levels and your seniors. The best thing you can do for your business is invest in your early talent pipeline. But that is a cost, and it is a cost in effort and resource and time, and it's a lot harder to do when you're working remotely. So I think we have seen companies engage less with our apprenticeship scheme, for instance, this year. That's been tough to get off the ground, and grad schemes have been paused or halved. And we'll feel the effects of that 3 years from now, won't we? 3 years, 4 years from now, when we've got very appreciable gaps. So I'm very much hoping that the sort of the crisis phase, that we get over that, and we realize that we've just got to continue to invest in early careers in ways that we had before, and just find new ways of doing it. But it is tough for businesses, I think.
Absolutely. So looking a bit more to the future then, when businesses were asked about the skills that they felt would be key in relation to the growth of their company over the next 3 years, sales and development came out on top. Do you think this is this could either be a sign that businesses are having to rebuild from the pandemic, or does it mean that we're actually in a more competitive industry and things are heating up in the industry? So what's your thoughts on that, Alison?
Yes, I was really surprised by this, because this is one of the things that you can definitely rely on, is that the answer to that question will be developers. I will need developers. So I was quite surprised. I think it is about absolutely all the the reimagining and restructuring that people have had to do, and I think probably businesses are assuming that the economic environment is going to get tougher from here. But I do also wonder if we've seen a lot less churn in from our technical teams. There's just been a lot less movement, less leavers, less starters. Workforces have felt much more static, which for lots of businesses is probably a bit of a welcome break from the churn we usually see from technical people. So I do wonder if people are taking that opportunity to put their investment elsewhere.
Yeah. What's your take, Mel?
I think that I would agree with Alison that there's been less churn. I think it's difficult for people to think about moving jobs at the moment, although people definitely are. It's really interesting to me that sales and marketing came up so high. I didn't expect to see that either, but I'm really pleased, because as a person whose background is in marketing, I'm always banging on about companies about how they should invest more and spend more time in it. I think people are finding that the world is more competitive, because particularly if you're business to business, your customer base have probably got less to spend. So they're looking a lot more carefully at what they're buying and what kind of return they want on that. So if you haven't got strong sales and marketing activity, it's hard to carve off your share of a smaller budget that's out there. I think also that for a lot of companies, smaller companies particularly, who had been able to carry on quite nicely just with their business, just through their personal networking, through who they bumped into in the pub or the coffee shop, through the conversations that you have naturally without thinking, oh, this is a sales or a marketing call. They've had that taken away because there's less of that opportunity to bump into people and to have those conversations. And they've realized that actually sales and marketing is something that we need to focus on specifically, rather than it just being something that happens as a natural part of what we're doing. And then they're looking at themselves and at their skills base and thinking, oh, I don't have the skills to do that. I don't know how to get started with that. Therefore, I should get some expertise in. And I think that's a really good thing. I think that'll make for stronger businesses in the long run. What I'm slightly concerned about is that when people say they want sales and marketing skills, what they're actually saying is we want someone to do a bit of social media for us. Because there is a lot more to a sales and marketing strategy than having someone do a bit of social media. So I got my fingers crossed that that's not the case.
Yeah, Ben, how about down in the southwest? Is this is sales and marketing proving a priority there?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting because as Mel and Alison said, I wouldn't have said it was the first thing that people would have talked about. And I don't know whether that's because I'm conditioned for years and years of people complaining that there's not enough devs. But I think this last few months, certainly for some of the smaller companies, has really reminded people that, as Mel was saying, you really have to be able to pin down what your value is and explain your value in a way. And I think I'm and lots of other people are terrible for sort of undervaluing the importance of good sales and marketing. The type of people that can do that, it is a skill set, and it's an art in itself. And lots of the businesses we're working with have realized, I think, that being able to do that, and being able to do that in what they're repeatedly being told now is more and more of a global market, and the sort of all of the many sunny uplands that Brexit have promised us, it's not a surprise that people are thinking about doing more sales and marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that we have heard over the last year or so of craziness have been obviously we've had lots of staff on furlough, and heard stories of people being bored and quitting to start their own businesses. Do you think we're going to see a baby boom of new businesses out of this time? Mel, I think you had some thoughts on this.
I really hope so. I think tough times always spark a certain amount of get up and go in people who perhaps have always had something on the side that they thought they might do, but never really had the impetus to do it. I certainly think that there's a contingent in the public sector who are really hoping that there's going to be a wave of startups who will help create jobs for unfortunately, all the people who are going to be unemployed as a result of this, particularly younger people. For me, the key thing is whether we have the right kind of support mechanisms in place to really wrap around those people who do start a business and help them to get up and running fast, to help them to do, really quick check of, do I have a good idea here? Is this concept going to fly? Do I have potential customers? And then how do I turn this into a business and get it out there onto the market? So I hope that alongside that sort of looked for surge in startup activity, there will be a surge in support for that activity. And I think that the support may need a bit of a rethink in terms of how it's structured. I mentioned the issue of young people particularly being hit particularly hard by the pandemic, not being able to find jobs, or the jobs and apprenticeships and internships they were expecting to go into just evaporating. There's an opportunity there to tap into that energy and that talent and use it to create new businesses. But there has to be a recognition as well that young people without experience of the working world are going to need support and engagement from people who've been there and done it a couple of times. And that comes back to this issue of having the right kind of support available. But I'm hopeful for startups. We've seen it before in other periods of recession. And I think a lot more people have played around with digital and might be thinking about how that will bring their ideas to life. But we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I suppose the other issue about furlough is, and this is something that has been raised in the media quite a lot over the last few months, is the idea of how many companies out there are basically just on life support by keeping some staff on furlough, and actually they're not actually that viable. Alison, does furlough and the end of furlough concern you?
I suppose we're a lot less exposed than other sectors, clearly, like hospitality, for instance. All that said, there's quite a strong travel sector in Manchester that has a digital component, which a lot of those people are very much still on furlough. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I do think the startup thing, I think anecdotally that's right. I think many people are starting businesses. I think it's very interesting in the way that our culture now supports and encourages that in a way that I don't believe it would have done maybe 15 years ago. That actually, the sort of the flight, I would have expected to see a sort of a flight to security, trying to get, kind of corporate jobs that you think have going to have some sort of, longevity and structure to them. Whereas in fact, actually people are risking it and going out on their own, which I think is very healthy. But I do very much agree with Mel that I think we've felt in Manchester for quite some time that our startup sector is a bit weak, and that it does somehow lack support, and we don't have very many success stories, to be honest, where startups, Manchester has been around a really long time, so by this point we should have seen a good few startups go through scale up and be household names. There's not that many examples of that, so we've still got a lot to get right, I think.
Your thoughts on this, Ben?
Yeah, I think certainly the support angle is something that's going to need a lot of thought. Like, historically, lots of people do set up businesses in difficult times and recessions. Sort of famously, Airbnb and Uber and people like that all started in the last recession. And you can already see people like Hopin. They're already a unicorn. They did start pre-COVID, but I would say COVID has probably had something to do with their success. We're starting to see more and more businesses start, and some really interesting founders and entrepreneurs who have had really exciting careers who are now taking the opportunity, but making sure they're given the right access to what they need to scale is going to be really key. Otherwise, we're going to really lose an opportunity.
No, we can't. We've only got a few minutes left. We haven't talked about diversity and inclusion, which is obviously a huge part of any skills agenda, and as well it should be. We are perhaps disappointingly and unsurprisingly nowhere near where we should be, sadly. According to the audit, 62% of all roles are filled by people identifying as male, and that's up to 72% for technical roles. And the sector is 87% white. And it says that in shamingly large text in the report, which I suspect is deliberately to make a point. So you could say the pandemic could make this worse. Mel, you were telling me you thought that might be an issue.
I think the pandemic has really shone a spotlight on inequality in our society, and inequality of access to digital. The issue with kids in school not having laptops that they can do their remote learning on, not being able to get sufficient connectivity at home to be able to do that even if they did have a laptop. I mean, this is just, it's unforgivable in our society, and it's interesting to see how many initiatives have sprung up to recycle laptops and get them out to the children and their families. I think that when you've got this kind of gap in opportunity, then digital seems to fall into the laps of those of us who are well off and not challenged by diversity issues. And if anything, we should be pushing that the other way and trying to get opportunities to as many people as we can. Because as a sector, we need that diversity desperately. We need to be reflecting the society for which we are creating products and services. Otherwise, what are we doing? It just makes no sense to me. But there's just a risk that some of the small steps forward that we were starting to make will have just ground to a halt during this past year. And because everyone's going to be under so much pressure as things do very gradually start to get back to whatever normal is going to look like, this will fall off our radar. We won't be paying attention to it, and we'll end up further back than we were when all of this started. I don't have any answers for that, but I think it's absolutely crucial that we not take our eye off this problem and that we not let it slip down our list of priorities.
Yeah, Ben, any thoughts about what we can do about this?
So I think it is, as Mel was saying, there's a real risk that it will fall behind. And certainly down here, although there is a lot of talk specifically around diversity and inclusion and pulling down of statues, there isn't a huge amount of specific resource to solve the problem. So what's happened traditionally is people have been involved in initiatives and programs because they think it's really important and they want to solve it. And there's an acceptance that this isn't going to be solved quickly. This is a generational problem, effectively. But when we all have less resource, when we all have less capacity, there's less chance of us to do things. There are some programs that are focused on this now much more than ever, and I think it really behooves us to do more of that, because there is a real risk that it will get even worse than it is at the moment.
Yeah, Alison.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do absolutely agree with that. I suspect we will go backwards. I think the moving forward on diversity inclusion requires not just good intentions from organisations, and I do believe most organisations have very good intentions. It does require specific action, often very hard to take specific action. And even in my own business, where we really do care, there's no doubt the first 6-7 months of the year, plans we had for a diversity accelerator program, we shelved them because we simply didn't have the space to think about it because we were in crisis mode, and essentially we let ourselves off the hook. So I do think it's one of the important jobs of the Manchester Digitals of the world to remind our members, remind everybody that this is a real problem, and just because we have other problems doesn't make this one less important. And to be fair, when COVID is mercifully in the real view mirror, we will still have these huge issues around opportunity and diversity in our industry. So we absolutely can't take our eyes off it. Is right.
Yeah, some things seem to never change when they absolutely should. Well, thank you very much to our panel for joining us today. Mel Kanarek from Sheffield Digital, Alison Ross from Manchester Digital, and Ben Shorrock from TechSpark. And now I shall hand back to Katie.